Hey, AP Govers. As promised, here is me going over some of the first unit exam. If I was not going to be in class today, I wanted to make sure I went over this with you. And don't be offended that I didn't turn the webcam on. I still have this allergic reaction. You don't need to see a swollen face. Anyway, I went through the multiple choice, and this is just concerning that. And for the most part, people did okay, but I got the four questions people had the most trouble with. So if it was like less than 70% got it correct. So let's go over the first one. The first one concerned Federalist 10. And we went over that a lot. But so when you saw the options being about factions, that may have confused you because you know it's about factions, but you have to remember just what about factions. So, little review. James Madison wrote Federalist 10, and it was about factions. Remember, factions are to liberty like air is to fire. That idea that they're dangerous, but they're essential at the same time. And Madison knew you couldn't get rid of factions, but you had to do what was best to manage them. And he believed that a big republic was best for these factions. So when the question asks what he argued, he didn't argue that small republics are better to ensure liberty because he wanted large republics, right? So you should have been able to cross small republics off right away. So then you have to remember, well, what about factions did he believe? And that this Republican representation would help to limit the excesses of factionalism, the dangers of it, right? The more factions you have, the more they can protect the rights of the minorities. So another big part of that unit was checks and balances, how they work to protect liberties, how they work to prevent tyranny, how they work to prevent an abuse of power. Each branch has several specific roles. And if you're looking at an example of a checks and balance, it helps if you see a branch, two branches involved with something. So an example of this would be that the president can make treaties, but 2/3 of the Senate has to agree with them, right? So they can check the power of the executive branch. Okay, so the Constitutional Convention. Remember, this was to modify the Articles of Confederation, but of course, it scrapped the Articles of Confederation and created a whole new government. So if the question is asking what didn't they discuss at the Constitutional Convention, one thing you can think of is, well, what ended up in the Constitution? Was there a system for representation in the Constitution? Well, yeah, that's all in Article 1. Was there a way of how to elect the president? Yeah, that was in Article 2. What about vetoes, right? The checks and balances. That's in there as well. What isn't in there is anything about state voting qualifications. Remember, after the multiple choice, I went over how states have different rules about voting and how federal law has changed about voting over the years. But remember, we also discussed why a lot of the issues with elections going on right now are because different states have different rules, different qualifications. So remember, that is not in the Constitution. So that's not one thing that they didn't discuss, right? That was an element to leave some rights to the states to sort of appease them a little bit and make the states realize they still had some things, some powers of their own. All right, and now the last question people struggled with was the question on types of democracy. We spent a significant amount of time on this, so you should have plenty of notes to go over in classwork assignments. Remember, we discussed elite, pluralist, and participatory. I didn't read this book, by the way. And just make sure you know the three different types. And in a pluralist, right? Plural means many, right? So the idea that many interests are competing for influence in government. right? Not just one, not just the elite, for example, or not everyone, but many interests competing for those governments. And we gave examples of those types of interests. Okay, so hopefully I would go back through your notes and look through these slides and see if it makes sense to you. And we'll discuss things with the FRQs as we learn more FRQs.